Welcome back to Day 2 of Sport Integrity Week, powered by MasterCard. Ben Jacobs with you for the evening session. Make sure you get in touch with us. Hashtag is SIW, and you can also participate via the app. We'd love your questions. Lots of industry experts on the line, and we've got an excellent panel coming up right now called Fight for Your Rights, Digital Piracy and IP Protection. Moving on to this panel is really important. We'll be talking about broader piracy issues, but the topic specifically gained added press and pertinence this summer after Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund, with the Crown Prince and Media Minister amongst their board, tried and failed to buy Newcastle United. The Premier League faced calls to reject the group due to alleged links between the Saudi Arabian government and a pirate network called Be Out Q, which broadcast in Saudi Arabia in place of the official Premier League broadcaster beIN Sports. The Premier League in the end didn't actually have to make a determination after PIF withdrew their bid, citing Premier League delays and COVID-19 as their specific reasons. Piracy, though, was also thought to be a big factor. Be Out Q was born out of a political feud between Saudi and Qatar, and it ended up stealing rights from all over the world, devaluing them in the process. And ultimately, the Premier League were faced with determining whether those who were part of PIF and potentially linked to the Saudi Arabian government wanted to buy Newcastle, but were also behind stealing their rights. We'll discuss this in detail and, like I say, talk about widespread piracy and other areas too over the next 45 minutes. We've got a tremendous panel. They are as follows. Sophie Jordan is beIN's Executive Director of Legal Affairs. Damian Collins is the Conservative MP for Folkestone and Hythe, and he was also the chair of the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Committee. Mark Lichtenhein is chairman of the Sports Rights Owners Coalition, and Jacques de Vera is director of the Digital Law Centre at the University of Geneva. I should also just add before we start that we did approach King & Spalding, the legal firm representing the Saudi government. So as we talk specifically about Be Out Q, I will reference any statements or their perspective for balance. But Sophie, I want to start with you because I've set this up with the premise of Be Out Q. And the reason for that is because Be Out Q was different. It was more advanced than other pirate networks that we've seen. Why was that the case?
Well, yeah, first of all, hi, good afternoon, everyone. It was very different. The Be Out Q operation was the most brazen pirate operation that in the history of pay television, really. I'm general counsel of beIN, and I've spent most of my career in pay television and with a focus on live sports. And I've had a front row seat to the rise of the faceless competitor that is pay TV piracy, but Be Out Q was a different sort of operation, that is for certain.
And Sophie, just to be clear, beIN's allegation is that this advanced pirate network was, in some capacity at least, state-sponsored or supported.
That's correct. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia had a very clear role in facilitating and backing Be Out Q operations. You had 10 different channels that were carried on Arabsat. Arabsat is an operation that has its headquarters in Saudi Arabia, that is controlled by Saudi Arabia. And the WTO did a very extensive fact-finding exercise, and that corroborated all the evidence that we've been gathering for 3 years. So there is no doubt that the Saudi Arabian government facilitated the Be Out Q operations.
Damian, let's get your take on this. From a government perspective, you would have worked closely with the Premier League. beIN pursued their own legal action. Sophie's outlined some of that, but the Premier League independently tried 9 times to go to civil court in Saudi Arabia, and law courts wouldn't take on this case. What role during your tenure at the DMCS did you and that organisation play? Were you able to directly support the Premier League in any way to try and get to the bottom of this very advanced form of piracy? And if so, how?
Yes, we did support it. We had sort of quite detailed briefing for members of the committee about the issue. The problem of enforcement was the big problem, because it would appear that the Be Out was broadcasting from Saudi Arabia, and therefore really requires the support of the Saudi authorities to stop it happening. And we were also interested in whether there were things the government could do to act against satellite images coming into the UK and look at other channels of distribution for this pirated footage as well. But what we have to realise is that when something like that happens at scale, as we saw here, this is a direct attack on the sports industry, taking money out of the sports industry and damaging it. And if things like that are allowed to continue, then this has long-term repercussions for sports, for all sports, and therefore it's important that that action is taken. I was one of a number of MPs that also raised concerns about the bid for Newcastle United, and the idea of having a Premier League club owned by an investment fund that may have been had some indirect connection to this operation would have been incredible situation to be in and completely wrong. So I think it does shows that we need concerted international efforts to act against major breaches in copyright law, as we saw in this case. Otherwise, sport will be the loser. And we know that the business of sport, for elite sport, is really funded largely through broadcasting and the exploitation of the commercial rights that go with that. And therefore, if we want to protect sport, we have to protect sport's ability to earn money in that way.
You said you felt that PIF, who wanted an 80% stake in Newcastle United, would be wrong to assume control. Were you or any government members that you're aware of able to influence or lobby the Premier League at any point during the process, or do you stand by Richard Masters' comments that the actual owners and directors' test was entirely confidential, i.e. there was no government involvement, despite the fact that you've quite strongly said you feel the takeover was wrong?
Well, I mean, I can't speak for the government, so and I'm not aware whether there was any government contact on that issue. But I think Richard is right that the Premier League is actually, I think, certainly compared to other leagues, and certainly compared to the Football League in England, has held quite a robust interpretation of the owners and directors test, and challenged other clubs in the past about directors or investors that it's been unhappy with. So I'm sure it would have taken a very robust line with that. But I think it is certainly, I think, the role for government and the Parliament to speak out when we can see British businesses, British organisations who are being challenged by a rip-off of their IP and copyrighted materials in other territories. If it's been broadcast from a country where that country won't act, and the legal system won't support an intervention, that is very challenging. But we should also then look at the means of distribution. How is it being viewed from within the UK? If footage is being distributed through social media platforms, what action can we take to require those social media platforms to act against that content as well? How can we make it as difficult as possible for someone at scale to deliberately seek to exploit someone else's IP?
Jacques, let's bring you in here, whether in relation to BOutQ, which was more complicated because if it was state-sponsored, then ultimately those you're wishing to try are also running the courts out there, and BN obviously found issues, as did the Premier League, specifically trying to facilitate either civil or criminal action in Saudi Arabia. So you may wish to kind of comment on that, but in a more commonplace piracy case that's less advanced, how easy is it to track and shut down a digital pirate?
So thanks so much. I think this is one of the points that I wanted to mention from the outset, and obviously I cannot speak from the digital trenches. I will give my view from a more global digital IP policy perspective. And I think one challenge in this entire question that goes beyond the discussion that we're having now about sports content, if we want, and this is the title of the panel, fight for our rights, we have to fight to get access to the relevant data. And I think this is something which is critical, and that was also alluded to by my previous panelist, the importance of also the intermediaries, the social media platform, who basically control the data and can potentially provide clue as to who has done what in the online environment. And on that front, I think, to make it short, I think we still have a way to go. Even beyond the topic that we're talking right now, I was rereading again a recent decision of the Court of Justice of the EU, which basically said back in July that it's not possible to obtain from platforms, specifically YouTube, email addresses and phone numbers of potential infringers, because the reading was a narrow one, which was to say basically it's only the physical address of the potential infringers which can be obtained. So, and that somehow relates to what Francis Gary was saying a few minutes ago in terms of bringing to the digital world some of our IP system. I think this is a clear sign that we still have a way to go. And the challenge here, and I'll stop there, is that we have a conflict of rights. We have obviously the rights of the IP owners, which should be enforced. But at the same time, as we know, we also have a strong system of protection of personal data. So we have to find a balance, and I think we still have to go and work on that, also from a, let's say, scientific perspective, to make sure that we make it possible to enforce the IP rights adequately in the digital environment.
Mark, let's bring you in here. Ultimately, most illegal pirate streams will come from legal ones. Of course, there are scenarios where someone can just film a unique stream if they're in the stadium. They tend to be short goal clips and relatively easily removed by the major federations. But with more complex piracy, if the stream is coming from a legal one, so in the case of Be Out Q, it was off obviously a beIN Sports box, and somehow the digital fingerprint was able to be scrambled, and eventually thousands and thousands and thousands of boxes were used, and there's not much therefore of a trail. But what I want to ask you with piracy in light of that is, are rights holders equally as responsible for ensuring they have enough protection to prevent piracy, or do you feel that the pirates themselves are these days just too advanced?
Well, thanks, Ben. I mean, there is no doubt that the piracy is getting more and more sophisticated. I mean, the Be Out Q example is obviously an extreme one, but more generally, we're seeing more and more sophisticated methods being used by pirates to, as you say, steal a legitimate stream from a set-top box or a digital app and then redistribute it around the world with impunity. I mean, Jack and Damien have already mentioned the key word here about enforcement. You know, we have laws, we have rules on these things, but most of them are not adequate to deal with the threat of piracy, because the key thing with piracy is the time it takes to act. I mean, our laws that we have are not expedient enough to get streams removed in a way that would stop the value being eroded. Let's face it, you know, live sport, that's where the value is in sport. An hour and a half after the event, most of the value is gone. So the ability to act immediately is absolutely key. Now, we have argued within the coalition for many years to get more rights for sports rights owners, because, as you know, a sport event isn't copyrightable in itself. It's not like a play or a film. The copyright comes through the broadcast signal, which is not owned directly by the sports rights owners. So we have to work closely with our broadcast partners. But we need to find ways, either legal or technological, to get streams taken down expeditiously. And that means 15 to 30 minutes, not 24 hours, which is kind of where the law might be at the moment.
Damien, it was referenced there that we need to find a way to take streams down. There's a danger, isn't there, in light of COVID-19, that more streams will actually crop up. Good news, at least today, that it looks like the Premier League will officially confirm that as long as fans are not in stadia, then those games will be made available, and thus there'll be a legal means to watch matches for fans who can't get into the stadiums. And the EFL have already replicated that and allowed clubs to commercialise games that are not currently televised. But are you worried nonetheless, in the context specifically of the United Kingdom, that COVID-19, with everyone at home, with everyone looking to try and watch lots of different sports, including those that take place in England, is there perhaps a concern that piracy might inadvertently or vicariously be on the increase because of COVID-19?
Well, I think COVID-19 creates a whole series of financial challenges for football. I'm not sure whether increased piracy is necessarily the one I put at the top of the list. I think the the lack of the loss of match day revenues will have potentially devastating consequences for many clubs who may end up playing behind closed doors even at a loss. And I think we should also be careful as well to say that the televising of these games that are being played because fans can't go into the grounds should be a short-term thing, because we don't want to breach the agreement that's been in place for many years that 3 o'clock matches on Saturday aren't televised to encourage fans to get into the grounds. But you all know, if you're watching, if your team is playing football and you're not watching it live and you heard they scored a goal, you can go on Twitter and you can search for the goal, and you will find quite quickly stuff that people have filmed on their phones and posted, maybe from watching on television, they've posted on social media. You'll also see that pretty quick, those films are taken down. So there's clearly the technical capability to identify this content and act against it quickly. Just as we know there's the technical capability to block things, block services from outside of a territory where the content is unlicensed. If you're a Netflix customer, you can access your Netflix account in different European countries, but the content you see varies from country to country because they use geolocation to determine what they have the license to show and what they don't. So I think a lot of the technology is there. It's a question of how we apply it. And I think it's applying it directly against sources being beamed in, looking to the social media companies to act to quickly remove content that's being distributed or shared through their services as well. But I think the technical means is there. It's about getting people on board to actually make sure this happens.
Sophie, Newcastle fans in particular will probably have followed the takeover that they, of course, wanted to happen from PIF, and now it's failed. They'll almost feel like the chapter's ended. But from beIN's perspective, although you had a media spotlight at that time, you're very much still fighting. The network itself officially closed down in August last year, but the boxes themselves can be repurposed, and thus the legacy, to a large extent, still continues. Can you just outline, therefore, the human impact to beIN Sports of Be Out Q in terms of the financial implications to the company, the logistical implications to the company? Because ultimately, having still not come to the end of your own legal process against Be Out Q or those behind it, my understanding at least is that beIN have lost potentially billions in legal fees and costs, and you've of course had to make a number of recent redundancies as well.
Yeah, that's correct. It's had a huge economic impact on our business and our capabilities. We have a multi-pronged legal approach and an investment arbitration against Saudi Arabia ongoing, in which we will claim substantial damages in the billions. But more importantly, you're right, it has left a legacy of piracy in the region, and that is not going away. And these Be Out Q set-top boxes are still deployed in Saudi Arabia and in other places in the region. And although they don't have the Be Out Q channels that have been taken down finally in August 2019, there are still pirate IPTV apps that function on those boxes, that function also on millions of other Kodi and similar IPTV pirate devices throughout the world. And while we address this piracy issue, we always seem to think it's a complicated legal matter, a complicated technical matter. But as Damien was saying, there are tools to take these pirate feeds down. It's just that they haven't been implemented. I mean, this session today is quite timely because today is the last day to respond to the EU consultation on the Digital Service Act that is hopefully will be a major overhaul of the core platform regulation in the EU and will address piracy in a meaningful way. Because when this directive was adopted 20 years ago, the priority at that time was to protect the development of what we call the highway information, the information highways. That's been done. Internet usage has developed at warp speed, and pirates have been incredibly quick studies. And they've developed a sophisticated multi-billion industry that has taken advantage of the fact that we have a piecemeal legal framework that makes it incredibly difficult to prosecute pirates, as Jacques was saying. Quite frankly, a lack of political incentive over the past 20 years to fix that legal framework. And the fact that there is a host of legitimate online industry stakeholders that benefit from a thriving IPTV pirate industry, like social media platforms, online platforms, hosting service providers, set-top box manufacturers, app stores. So we have to put in place the legal tools that allow us to take down these pirate streams, to do it quickly, not when the game is over. And there's a host of legal remedies that have been developed by much smarter legal minds than mine. It's just a matter of getting that into legislation and enforcing it.
And I want to follow up, and then off the back of Sophie's answer, Mark, you can come in on this one as well. beIN set potentially a precedent, Sophie, by starting post-COVID lockdown the remainder of the Serie A season on a blackout. And then after a couple of weeks, the games resumed, and they only aired on beIN because you renegotiated with Serie A. And effectively what beIN Sports argued was, because of widespread piracy, the Serie A rights are de facto non-exclusive rather than exclusive, and you got a rebate of almost 130 million, about 30% of the total value of the full rights deal with Serie A. Do you therefore feel, Sophie, that rights in the Middle East and beyond, because of piracy, especially advanced piracy, are going to be significantly devalued, and could beIN's precedent with Serie A bleed into other leagues? In other words, would you consider going back to the Premier League, for example, and saying, we also want a rebate, which of course, and ironically, would end up meaning that Newcastle United would get less money along with all of the other Premier League clubs?
I'm not going to address specifically a deal by deal or rights holder by rights holder, but there is an industry trend. I mean, the loss of revenue is huge. And we were talking about what is the size of this piracy. I mean, there's a Sandvine report from 2017, I think, that estimates that 6.5% of households in North America access pirate live TV services each month. And it's a loss of revenue to the whole industry of over 4 billion per year. And you compare that, which is kind of interesting, to the revenue that it generates for the pirates is around a quarter of that, or less than a quarter, because obviously, you know, they sell the content for nothing because they have no costs to actually produce these services or the content. So piracy combined with the effect of COVID is a deadly combination for the industry of sports.
Mark, your thoughts specifically on the value of rights being diminished, and potentially those that buy the rights coming back to the rights holders and asking for portions of their money back because of widespread piracy. Is that a very real possibility? I mean, as I said before, we specifically saw that with beIN Sports and Serie A.
Sure. No, I mean, every sports rights owner is critically aware of how the value of their product is being eroded in this way, which is exactly why we're all working very closely with our broadcasters and partners to address the issue. And, you know, as has been said, there are technological means out there, but they don't go far enough, and they're not being applied quickly enough. To be fair, the big players are, you know, cooperating with most of the sports rights owners, maybe not as quickly as we would like, but they are cooperating. But it's those that don't cooperate that are causing the real problems. And which is why, you know, we are lobbying heavily as part of the Digital Services Act to get an obligation on intermediaries to provide us, rights owners, with a takedown tool to remove content that we know to be infringing. And we can do that quickly because we know what our content is. This is not there's no ambiguity about whether the content is ours or not. It's fingerprinted, it's watermarked. And I know that, you know, all our members are happy to take the legal risk of taking down content which isn't theirs, because so far, you know, that's never happened. So absolutely, we are all critically aware of this, and that's why we're working so hard together to address it.
Jacques first, and then Damien off the back. I want to talk about punishments that are legally possible, both from a current perspective with Jacques, and then Damien, just your thoughts from what the government could do. Because a lot of what we see is shutting down the pirate network. And sometimes we see punishments for people that illegally stream things in pubs, or if the actual piracy crime is larger. But is there any dispensation, Jacques and then Damien, to flip it and start trying to crack down and punish on those that actually view the pirate streams? Because the first reaction of Newcastle United supporters, both when the Premier League hadn't allowed games to be streamed with no fans in them, and ultimately more broadly when PIF were under scrutiny, was to say, well, piracy's everywhere, we're watching it, we're streaming it. So they themselves are effectively admitting to a crime. But much like Napster in the world of music, an individual that just clicks on a link at the moment to watch a Champions League game or a Premier League game is not going to be punished. Is there any dispensation in your view, Jacques, to flip it and start targeting those watching the streams? And if so, what kind of legal standing would you currently be on?
Maybe I can answer by coming back to what Mark just said. I think it's very important. It's also reflected in what others said here, Sophie and Damien, because if we focus on the end user, I'm not too sure to what extent this would be relevant if you compare this to an action against platforms. And this is relating to what Mark said earlier in making sure that the platforms do cooperate. And to me, and I think it's quite important to realize that was already reflected by what has been indicated earlier, including by you, Mark, in saying that what is the essence is to have quick remedies in terms of injunction, because if you have injunctions, then you can stop or even prevent damages. But the thing is, and that's what I want to put on the table, is that it's not sufficient from my perspective to have legal remedies which would make it possible to go before court in any given country. We're facing global platforms and we need global remedies. We need a global digital justice. We need a way by which the platforms may have the obligation, under conditions to be defined, to cooperate and to take content down. And they do that already, as we know, massively today. And just a quick side note on a documentary that is interesting from that perspective, which is called The Cleaners, which basically tells about all the people working for Facebook taking content down. This is a massive job, and this can affect any type of content. And this is just away from courts. I'm not saying, of course, that courts are useless, but I say courts may be of relevance, but they will offer generally local solution at higher costs, at a slower speed. So platforms can offer some kind of justice, but they need guidance. And this is really kind of a, so to say, public-private partnership, which would need to be set up, and it's already taking place. We know there are instruments, but to me, that are too fragmented at the EU level in different jurisdictions. And you see even Facebook, as you may have seen, and you certainly know, which has set up its so-called oversight board to somehow help the platform to manage the content decision that they have to make. So I think it's very important, and I stop here, to realize that we may well go after the end user, but to me it would be more relevant to some extent to go to the source and see what solutions might be implemented and defined in order to go against those who facilitate in a way or another this massive digital piracy activities.
Damien, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think you have to start with the social media companies on the question of do they have liability or not. And of course, in American law, they don't have liability as intermediaries. That they're not required to intervene. They take the position it's not their legal responsibility unless someone is committing a sort of criminal act to intervene and take down content and footage. Be that harmful or in breach of copyright or whatever. You've got to go after the person who's doing it. Now, of course, the trouble is with a lot of people that distribute pirated materials is that they're not necessarily easy to trace. And therefore, the platforms do play a role because that is the system through which this content is distributed. Now, these are global companies, but they have to abide by the laws in the different countries where they trade. And if someone is clearly using their service to distribute copyrighted material illegally, for others to see, then they should act on that case. And I think that's something where we can legislate to require that sort of action. So far, it's largely been done through private agreements, certainly in terms of protecting copyright from the music industry and the film industry, to some extent for football highlights and clips as well. But we could go further and create that responsibility, just as we're currently looking to legislate to create legal responsibilities for the social media companies to have a sort of duty of care to their users and protect them from harmful content. So more could be done in that space. And in particular, if the rights holders in the industry can say, look, we can help you, we can give you code and information which will make it easier for you to identify people who are streaming and sharing, certainly at scale, pirated material, I think then we should say, well, if the companies refuse to do it, even though they could, then there should be some other intervention. The companies are, got to remember, the companies gather data about what everyone does so that they can serve advertising against those people. And if the companies are making money out of advertising being placed around content being shared on their platforms, and that content is pirated, then we should say, well, why should it be that in that situation a social media company could actually profit from piracy but not have any responsibility to stop it?
Sophie, if I could ask you about evidence gathering, I'd imagine that some things were reasonably easy, and beIN and the Premier League have commissioned independent agencies to look at things like frequency analysis, but other things with piracy are needed from someone in the inside, i.e. a whistleblower. And The Guardian's David Conn in a previous panel yesterday made an excellent point that whistleblowers tend to at times be vilified rather than paraded as heroes. And it's a fine line, isn't it, with Be Out Q, because the whistleblowers that you've used to gain things like moving footage and still photography of the alleged HQ within Saudi Arabia, which is very important, and that's in Riyadh, or a call center in Daman, which was also a television office, which again is important because all of these things ultimately tie Be Out Q back to both Saudi Arabia and the Saudi Arabian government. But when you work with these whistleblowers, how difficult is it? Because if it was a different region or if it was a different topic, you might be able to gain the evidence, use everything in court and move quite quickly. But unfortunately, in Saudi Arabia specifically, some of the people providing you with your information, if they're found out, they could find that their lives are ended, or they're bullied, or they're kicked out of the country. It's almost a case of having to safeguard your whistleblowers, is it not?
Well, it's always difficult working with whistleblowers, be it in the piracy world or other issues, more serious issues actually. In terms of this specific issue and whistleblowers regarding Be Out Q, the difficulty here is not so much the when they come to us, they usually are no longer in Saudi Arabia, so that is not an issue.
Mark, if I can just turn to you and maybe first explain the context and then go on to clarify why you took this particular stance. The Sports Rights Owners Coalition said relatively recently that it was pretty disappointed in the EU directive. You called it a missed opportunity for sports. You said that the EU's copyright directive failed to help rights holders protect themselves from piracy. Why was that, and what instead did you want that directive to say?
Yes, well, thanks, Ben. I mean, as you may know, we lobbied very hard to have an amendment to the new copyright directive, which would effectively give sports rights owners a neighbouring right in the audiovisual content that is being pirated. So to my point earlier, we wouldn't be dependent on working with our broadcasters together. We could act unilaterally to protect the rights of the content within the broadcast, which would have, again, help the speed of the process rather than having to work together collectively at each time. So that's why we felt it was a missed opportunity. Ironically, the European Parliament did approve our amendment initially, and it was only in the trilogue process with the Commission and the Member States that our amendment was thrown out. We did get a declaration as part of it instead, which was a few crumbs, I suppose, but we're working very hard to get something out of that in the context of the Digital Services Act. But that's why we thought it was a missed opportunity, because it didn't give sports rights owners the kind of rights that the press were given to their content, which was also part of the directive.
Damien, I'm not sure whether you were specifically across this, but did you or the British government have a particular stance on the directive that Mark just referenced?
I mean, it's not something I was involved with directly, but the UK government, has always sought to develop a robust structure for protecting IP and Premier League footage, in particular Premier League content, is hugely valuable to the league and to sports and football of the UK, and something we take a very big interest in. I remember there was a lot of lobbying around the case of the pub landlady who was showing TV footage from Greece, using a Greek box to broadcast live games to her customers, and the government very strongly supported the Premier League in seeking to take action to stop that happening, because it was a clear breach of their copyright laws and the protections that they sought to have. So I think it is something that is taken very seriously. A lot of the issues we've been discussing here, though, are about it's how do you take enforcement when the piracy may be difficult to detect who's doing it and where they're doing it from, or they're doing it in a jurisdiction where you don't have the weight to act. I do think international bodies clearly have a role here, and I think collectively, not just bodies like the EU, to put pressure on countries or regions of the world where we believe piracy is taking place, but the sports bodies as well. I think it should be up to FIFA and UEFA to be saying to the football authorities in a country where it's believed activity is taking place to undermine the copyright of another football competition elsewhere in the world, that some pressure is brought through those authorities as well. I think we need to use international cooperation wherever we can to try and take action or try and affect action and change in hard to reach parts of the world.
Yeah, I completely agree. And Sophie, Bian have obviously found that with that lack of international cooperation, you've predominantly had to go via first Saudi Arabia, and that's proven a bit of a dead end. You've obviously gone to the EU and the World Trade Organization, but the only other case outside of the ones I've mentioned, or the big one anyway, was in France. And what you found there was, even though the court agreed with you that there was a case to answer against Arabsat, because Arabsat's signals were so weak in France, there was no commercial malpractice, and ultimately beIN were not able to claim any damages as a result. So how can beIN get some kind of clarity, or I would imagine you would use the word justice, when you've at this point almost explored all of your legal avenues already? Clearly you don't want to give up, but you also don't want to just keep spending millions and millions and millions and it going around in a big loop, because then you may lose rights, you may lose employees, and beIN as a broadcaster will come out of this a lot weaker.
The purpose of the action in France was to establish in the court of law that Arabsat was indeed broadcasting BRQ. So that objective was achieved and was recognized in the WTO proceedings as well. The normal route when you are faced with a pirate operation of this size, and we are not talking about a classic IPTV pirate operation. We know who these people are. It's not a matter of finding them out. We know where they're operating from. We know who they are. We know what where they're broadcasting from, how they're doing it. And the normal route would be to be able to sue in Saudi Arabia. We weren't able to do that for the reasons that you explained, and nor were all the other major rights holders, starting with the EPL, La Liga, FIFA, UEFA, and the host of rights holders that were by beIN's side in these proceedings. Which is why we had to get legally creative and try and explore different avenues. And the most important one of which, in terms of financial compensation, is the investment arbitration against Saudi Arabia that beIN has initiated 2 years ago. So it's a long process, and this is, I say this a lot, the legal time is not necessarily commercial time, but all good things come to those who wait, in particular when they're on the right side of the law.
Can I just briefly ask you as well, Sophie, Saudi Arabia is, or was, depending on which way you look at it, beIN's biggest market, but your license there was suspended and more recently terminated for an alleged commercial malpractice called bundling. I should point out that BRQ and most major sports broadcasters do bundle, and it would be deemed a marketing practice, but Saudi Arabia alleged that that's illegal and thus cause to terminate your license. So what that means from a piracy point of view, Sophie, is that there's no legal means at the moment to watch the Premier League and many other rights in Saudi Arabia. How worrying is that, and what's the solution? For example, would beIN Sports consider granting Saudi Arabia country-specific tender if the Premier League agreed to that? Or given your contract still has a few years to run, would you also consider allowing Saudi Arabia to negotiate their own deal whilst yours still runs, simply to get rid of all the politics and the feud and to alleviate any concerns of BOutQ returning?
Well, I mean, if we were to go down that path, that would simply mean that it's a blueprint for rogue states or pirate operations, as to force your hand into getting the content that you want, or unwanted sub licenses. So, I mean, I don't see that is an appropriate response to what still remains the biggest pirate operation the pay TV industry has seen.
Mark, and also Jacques, can I ask you about poorer countries or even leagues and federations? Because in talking about BOutQ, it's unique, it's advanced. beIN Sports have lost a lot of money, but they've also got a lot of money to throw at it. And ultimately, the Middle East and North Africa is a lucrative region. But piracy is widespread all over the world, in rich countries and in poor countries. So how would a poorer rights holder that can't afford to challenge piracy try and get illegal streams removed? Because ultimately, that's probably, in terms of numbers, even though not in terms of complexity, just as prevalent as the BOutQs of this world.
Well, that's true, but I think you have to recognise that the smaller leagues don't have such lucrative contracts in the first place, so they're not so reliant on broadcast income. I mean, there's a disproportionate reliance, or there's a growing reliance, if you like, on broadcast income. The bigger you are. Smaller leagues are reliant much more on sponsorship and match day income, that kind of stuff, which makes up a bigger percentage than their rights revenues. But I mean, look, I mean, it's always a balance, and as you say, as has been said many times, this is a global problem, which is why we need to work together to solve it. And I would just say that there are different types of piracy. I mean, we've focused a lot on BOutQ, which is a very specific example, and we've talked about organized crime networks, which you can, to Jack's point, that is the legal route to close down somebody who's week in, week out reselling your content. But we are faced with a lot of smaller piracy operations that don't operate at scale but still erode the value of sport, and that's why we need to have more effective collaboration with the intermediaries to get this content taken down. That's very sophisticated, as we said, but there are not that many dedicated service providers who are actually able to stream all this content at scale, and that's why we at the coalition are very keen to get those kind of organizations to cooperate more closely with us, so that the sites or the servers that are serving apps, websites, IPTV networks, they can all get closed down at the same time.
Jack, if it was financially viable, is one solution, as well as the digital age grows, for the bigger leagues to consider going direct to consumer, and thus all the rights would be in one place? Because one worrying aspect as digital grows, but lots of different providers come in, like look at the UK, where you've got BT Sport, you've got Sky Sports, you've got Amazon, the BBC may get some games, and if some or all of them charge nominal fees, eventually it adds up to the consumer, and before you know it, if they're not all shared on the same cable network, you might have to end up paying 2, 3, 4 amounts of anything from between £5 and £20 a month to eventually get all of the games. And then if there's free streams running concurrently, a lot of people will say, well, I paid my $9.99 to Amazon, but I don't really want to pay for BT Sports, so I'm just going to find that on an illegal website somewhere. If the Premier League, should it be financially viable, chose to put their rights in one place digitally, would that help or hinder things?
I think one concern, I can speak as to what would be the situation in the UK law and EU law, but I would assume that this may be challenging from the perspective of competition law. We know sports rights, joint selling, and this type of arrangements may raise issue of competition law because they might be found to be not positive for the consumers who may end up paying a higher price. That would be my reaction. But if I may just quickly react to an important point which was made by Mark as well as Sophie in terms of global solution, as you said, Mark, and also Sophie, the fact that you're entering this potentially less conventional route of investment arbitration. The point that I just wanted to mention is that investment arbitration is becoming more usual, so to say, even for IP disputes. There are a few high-profile cases for investment arbitration, which somehow show and confirm what we already know, is that in many businesses, the value is in the intangible, and this is IP, and you see a lot of cases pending or already decided, which show that investment arbitration may be of relevance also in this context, and which could offer the advantage to provide a neutral forum where, as you were saying earlier, Sophie, it's not possible to go before local courts.
Damien, from the DMCS's perspective, what kind of tightrope is that department walking, if you like? Because clearly there's wider politics and relationships with a number of governments. And I think, as Jacques correctly pointed out, BOutQ is a very specific case. But in this specific case, if the DMCS agrees with the Premier League and beIN Sports and thinks that BOutQ was Saudi sponsored, but at the same time, the wider government has positive and ongoing relationships with the same Saudi Arabian government, then how involved can you get in piracy without treading on other relationships with exactly the same government?
It's unusual for these things always to be government sanctioned, even though people may think there is a link, and clearly it can be frustrating if you don't feel the government in that country is really doing very much to intervene to stop this happening. So you can obviously take this up diplomatically with another government, and that's normal part of relationships between countries, that there are issues that cause concern and you bring them up. But what we can do is look at the method of distribution of this sort of footage, and what can we do to disrupt that and put standards in place that requires intermediaries and other platforms to identify that footage and act against it when they see it and when they can easily discover it. These are the sorts of debates we're having in the context of online harms, about harmful content on the internet, looking at how that spreads from platform to platform and looking at where it comes from, and looking at how we create certain standards and charters for those companies to follow that could be enforced in UK law. That's being looked at on the EU level. It's being looked at in Australia, and so these are some of the sorts of things you can do, even if it is difficult to act within territory, within a foreign territory, to stop things happening there. But I mean, this is a debate that has evolved as the internet has developed, but it's increasingly important as the internet-based platforms and social media platforms are increasingly the way in which people view and share audio-visual content. So we have to, it is much easier to spread pirated material, breach of copyright material in this way, and for all sorts of different reasons, whether it's to make money out of spam content and advertising, or to deliberately undermine the business model of another organization. What we can do is look at those channels of distribution, because ultimately it's being consumed by people in the UK using servers and platforms that reach people in the UK. Other governments can do the same thing as well. So that is certainly an area where we can act, and it is a very live topical issue on a whole range of issues to do with content on the internet at the moment.
And Sophie, just finally to you, as a rights holder, were you able to directly lobby government or the Premier League during the proposed Newcastle United takeover because of piracy? Mixed reports are out there. The Financial Times stated that beIN Sports directly met with Richard Masters and raised their concerns. But of course, Richard Masters said that whole process was confidential. So have you been on the piracy front a lobbying voice only from the outside, or did you actually have a direct line to the Premier League over the course of the last 2 months, specifically on this takeover?
Actually, I don't think we needed to, because the Premier League was extremely familiar with the BOutQ issue and the involvement of Saudi Arabia having themselves tried to file a complaint in Saudi Arabia and failed, and having been turned down by 9 different law firms in Saudi Arabia to take on that complaint. What we did do is write to the Premier League and to the clubs to draw their attention on the issue and ask them to strongly interrogate the deal, and given the role played by the KSA in relation to a B-out-Q and the fact that it was the same buyer that was behind the takeover of Newcastle.
And Mark, just the final word to you. The future, what does it hold? Are we ending here on a positive note and saying that piracy will decline, or are we ending on a worrying note saying as digital evolves, piracy might increase? Is it an unknown land because of COVID-19? Just wrap things up for us.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I certainly don't think it's on its decline, and we've got a lot of work to do. I think there are some positive signs. We've worked very hard to get our message across, and as I say, to collaborate with all the relevant parties, because it's going to take everybody to do this. It's going to need more. We've touched on that issue of enforcement. We have a lot of rules which aren't being properly enforced at the moment. I think we've exhausted the legal routes right now, so we need to look more at technological means to do these things. But ultimately, unlike counterfeiting or something tangible, there is a digital footprint. Somebody knows, or some system knows exactly where this stuff is happening. And if we can get people to collaborate, share information where legally possible, I think we can get this under control. But it's going to need the collective will of all the parties involved and some political will as well.
Thank you very much indeed. That's unfortunately all we've got time for. It's been a fascinating debate. And if you had a question, I have thrown in most of the ones I got throughout the course of the panel. But if you've got any follow-ups, get in contact with us and we'll see if we can connect you to a specific panelist. But for now, that's all we've got time for on piracy. Thank you very much once again to all of our panelists and to you for participating. And we'll be back in about 10 minutes time with our next panel. That's at 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock CET, Sport Integrity Canada, exploring risks, seizing opportunities and projecting the future. But for now, goodbye.
Thank you.